At the appointed time, the battalion left the area of concentration. Even the July night after the exhausting stuffiness of the Teplushka did not seem as stuffy as it really was. With pleasure, I inhaled the fragrant air. A light breeze tickles my sense of smell with the odors of surrounding forests and cut hay. We walk without fear. Good thing fascist airplanes are not flying yet. In the west, bright flashes are dancing in the sky. The front is passing there. Apparently, it is still far away, because we can't hear even the bursting of artillery shells. Everyone is in high spirits. Miners are people, as I have already seen, who are not discouraged in any situation and have a great sense of humor. During 10-minute stops, they gather in groups, joking with each other without malice. Laughter can be heard in one group or the other. I envy them. I have to lead in battle people who are wise in life. Do I have the necessary knowledge and moral and combat qualities for this? In the military school, we, the cadets, constantly pointed out that loyalty to communist ideals and a high sense of duty, patriotism and internationalism should be a commander of the Red Army developed especially strongly. After all, he is endowed with the power that is given only to the military leader. Only the commander is given the right to lead people to face mortal danger in the name of victory over the enemy. So the commander is obliged to stand above his subordinates in moral terms, to be an authority, an example, a role model for them. We are constantly being told that the commander must have a special character, which is often referred to as military, and it is based primarily on a strong will, because all other qualities of a commander, discipline and self-discipline, rigorous demanding of himself and his subordinates, personal courage and bravery, are inherent only in a person of strong will. We were constantly taught that bravery and courage occupy a special place among all the qualities of a commander. To be brave means not to waver in the face of any danger a commander encounters in battle. To be courageous, we were told, means to have the ability to make courageous decisions, to take reasonable risks, to assume full responsibility for your decision, and to carry it out with iron determination. But memory resurrects the words I once heard in a lecture. The will must necessarily be spiritualized by a high noble idea. Otherwise, a strong will may be directed in the wrong direction. Every commander, and not only the novice, worried about the thought, will he be able to show all these necessary qualities of military character in the upcoming battle? Naturally, this thought worried me. I went around the resting soldiers, listening to their conversations. Unnoticed, I approached the group, where they laugh especially contagiously. So, boys? By voice I recognized Sergeant Vasil Soroshkin, inexhaustible storyteller and joker, the most cheerful and charming man in the company. It happened in the 31st. I fell in love with a girl. I loved her so much that it's impossible to describe. You have to experience it yourself. She was so fragile, so tender, that I was sometimes afraid to touch her when I met her. I look at her in silence and sigh. And Ganna, that was my mate's name, looked at me with her blue eyes and asked me with a smile, "What's the matter with you, Vasil? Aren't you sick?" And I only sighed noisily, like a drunken horse. I don't know what's happened to me. I've never been one for words, but here my tongue stuck to my palate. The storyteller was silent for a moment, sighed through and thoroughly rubbed the rest of the cigarette with his boot, and, as if remembering something very dear to his heart, continued with an affectionate smile. We saw each other every convenient minute. We couldn't live without each other, but to our misfortune, my Kohana's parents were devout people. They categorically demanded that we get married. I'm a Komsomol member. Church is off limits to me, and my Ganna was the only one of my parents. She loved and pitied them very much. She didn't want to go against their will, and to all my entreaties she sighed, "Be patient, my love, everything will work out somehow." It went on like that for almost a year. Finally, our Komsomol secretary, Oksana Sobko, found "Stand up," suddenly resounded through the column. Without having time to hear the love story of their comrade, the soldiers quickly take their places in the ranks. The column continues on its way. And so on every halt. Everywhere lively conversations and not a word about the war, as if they conspired only about relatives and friends, about home affairs. It seems that they wanted not to part with the former happy life, which was so treacherously violated by the fascists. I wanted to get away from thoughts about possible death, about those trials that await ahead. In July it dawns early. The sun disk has not yet appeared from behind the horizon, and it is already quite light around. Everyone looks at the cloudless sky with apprehension. Any minute fascist planes may appear. Judging by the time, We walked about 12 kilometers. When we stopped for another break, the commander Tankonoshenko ordered to take the company into the forest. He said that soon the cars should come up, on which we will overcome the rest of the way. Barely had we settled down in the forest, as the commander of the 2nd Platoon, Lieutenant Pavel Stepanov, ran up to me. Having corrected the belt on his truly girlish waist, he put his hand to his cap. "Comrade Commander," he whispered for some reason. Behind us in the clearing, a semi-truck with ammunition, and with it a chauffeur and a suspicious type in a commander's uniform. It is difficult to guess the rank. The buttonholes are spoiled, but, judging by the traces of arm patches, Captain, the message interested, running after Stepanov, fearing that the suspicious persons with a semi-truck will get away. However, the car was in place. The chauffeur was working on the engine, and a man in a commander's uniform was sitting on the step of the car, with his head hanging down on his chest. Who are you and where are you going? My tone is resolute and stern. The stranger slowly raises his head. There is surprise in his eyes. I repeat the question. Captain Sitnikov, we are coming out of the encirclement, he answers, continuing to sit. Are you a captain? My voice is full of contempt. Where are your insignia? You are an impostor. He looks at me angrily. You'll get surrounded, sucker. Then you'll know why I cut off the insignia. The Germans shoot commanders and political workers on the spot. What's in the car? Screw ammunition. The courtier intervenes in the conversation, seeing that his companion is confused. Where are you taking them? The front is there. I waved to the west. I was taking them to the service platoon of our battalion, but the captain, chauffeur, points to the seated man with resentment. He stopped me and ordered me to follow him, explaining that the Germans were ahead, that our whole regiment was killed. Is it true? Yes. The captain hesitated for a moment. Our division was surrounded. I miraculously jumped out in a car, which was overturned by an explosion on the road. The driver was killed. I met this one on the way and turned it back. Otherwise it would have fallen to the Germans. I was new at the front, but I felt that the captain, if he was really a captain, was not telling me something. Why is he alone? Why was he driving a car with ammunition to the rear when our troops were fighting in front and every cartridge counted? Finally, why did he spoil his insignia? It's obvious cowardice, and how can you trust a coward? Your papers. In my voice less and less determination and rigor, I begin to doubt whether I have the right to question a senior officer. I have no documents. I buried them in the woods. The captain became even more angry. I seemed to say in human language that I was in the territory occupied by the Germans. I couldn't leave the documents with me, don't you understand, Lieutenant? I don't understand. I'm getting angry too. And in the Red Army, it's customary to address each other as you. Please follow me. And I think to myself, I'll hand this guy over to the headquarters, they'll sort it out. The ammunition will come in handy in the coming battle. But then the unexpected happened. The detainee, having said that he would take a field bag, opened the door, digging in the cabin, took out a revolver and sharply turned to face me. Although I had not expected such a turn of events yet, thinking that he would shoot at me, I automatically snatched the revolver from the open holster. But the captain put the muzzle to my heart and pulled the trigger. A muffled shot rang out. The captain toppled over, hitting his head on the foot of the car. I looked back at the chauffeur. There was a squeamish grimace on his face. He spat and, swearing, said bitterly, "And such a coward I believed. Comrade Commander, turning to me, he stretched out his arms at the seams. Now I will not find my regiment. I'll really fall into the hands of the Germans. Take me with you. I have a rifle, and a German machine gun, by the way, in the cabin. I'll be useful in battle." I look into the eyes of the fighter. He responds with an open, bold look, as if saying, "Don't be afraid, I won't let you down." Have you ever been in combat? Since the first day of the war, I've been retreating from the border. I participated in battles as a machine gunner in a rifle company, and then, when the driver of our only car in the battalion died, I, as a former tractor driver, was put in his place. Only 3 times I had to go for ammunition. I went to the 4th, and then fascist tanks broke through to our rear. I wanted to get to the battalion by the forest road, but the captain ordered me to follow him. I obeyed him in vain. After a silence, the driver thoughtfully, as if thinking aloud, said, "Where is our regiment now? What about it?" "Did you know the captain?" "That's right. He's from the regiment headquarters." Having made sure that the chauffeur is an experienced warrior, I look with interest at his simple, broad-skinned face covered with small freckles, on which light blue eyes, as if burned out in the sun, stand up. He has been fighting for the 3rd week now and has been in retreat the whole time, but there is no confusion in him. He's taut, his oil-stained uniform neatly patched, his face clean-shaven. I would have gladly enrolled him in my company, but only the regimental commander could make such a decision. I ordered to drive the car to the commander. On the way, with interest, I asked the soldier about the battles in which he participated. I wanted to know how he would explain the reason for the retreat of our troops, and my question the soldier, having levelled the car after the next bump, answers confidently, as if he had already thought about it more than one. All the trouble is in the tanks. We overpower his infantry. I have never seen it break through us without tanks. The German is weak in hand-to-hand combat. He can't stand face-to-face. He only fights when he's had enough schnapp. They call it vodka, explains the soldier. When you fight with the Nazis chest to chest, then such a spirit stares in your nose, as if a barrel of vodka spilled under your feet. In general, you can beat them, but it's hard to resist tanks. They launch them in a solid wall. The artillerymen shoot them down one by one, and new ones crawl out after them. The artillerymen don't have time to stop them, and some of them have such armor that shells bounce off them like peas off a wall. Many of them break through to the infantry. That's when it's hard. They crawl along the trenches and spin in one place. They all try to level the trenches with the ground, to bury the infantryman alive in them. And infantrymen had nothing against tanks at first. Then commanders taught me to tie grenades in 5 pieces, 4 with handles to one side and the 5th to the other. Not everyone will throw it under the tank from afar, and it is necessary to get exactly under the caterpillar. Then our battalion commander, Captain Gillen, such a fighter and a great inventor, got some aviation gasoline in warehouse, ordered to collect in the nearest village all empty bottles, fill them with gasoline. And instead of a cork in the neck, pushed a piece of soaked in gasoline. It flares up instantly even from a burning cigarette, and here you catch the moment, throw it on the enemy tank. The bottle, when hitting the armor, shatters, the gasoline spreads and instantly bursts into flames. At first we threw anywhere, but then we were taught to let the tank pass us and throw the bottle after it, on the engine part. If you hit it, the tank is dead. Fire is inevitable. I listened to the story of a former soldier with excitement. After all, I had read about bottles of gasoline back in college. Not that in the newspaper, not that in a book on the Spanish Civil War. This is a find. Joyfully, I think. Set fire to the tank is easier than to get under the track of a heavy bundle of grenades. Combat Tonkanozhenko ordered to bury the suicide and leave the car with ammunition at the battalion. When I told the commander about the method of fighting with tanks, he looked at me in surprise. If this method was effective, it would have been stipulated by the statute, and the industry would have made us as many bottles as we needed. And with irony, he added, I know an even more effect. Throw a few bottles of our 40-degree water into the hatch of the tank. The tankers will drink it and get faint. Then take them naked. In vain combat, you are ironizing, intervened the deputy commander of the battalion on the political part, senior political officer Pigov, who was present at our conversation. Method, which says Altunin used the Spanish Republicans in the fight against the tanks of General Franco. I think we should consult with the regiment's Nochkim. He must know something about this business. All right, you consult, and now I have to take care of the safety of the march. Combat went somewhere in a hurry. The tragic event, an involuntary participant in which I became, imprinted in my memory. Decades have passed, and I still remember a young, full-of-strength man who died because of weakness and cowardice. A terrible, shameful death. The soul of this man died when he cowardly left his comrades. Wise people rightly say that cowards die many times, and courageous only once. Soon the automobiles came up. Having taken weapons and ammunition, the battalion continued its way to the front. Old trucks, howling with engines, slowly crept along the broken country roads, bouncing on potholes and leaving a plume of grey dust behind them. The column presented an excellent target for enemy aircraft. Only the mortal threat hanging over Vitebsky forced the commander of the 19th Army, Lieutenant General Kerniev, to move the troops even in the daytime. Not 2 hours later, as from the southwest appeared Junkers under cover of 6 Messerschmitts. The road on which our battalion was moving passed through the woods. Mixed forest then approached, then retreated from the road. The cars on which the mortars were placed were just crossing another meadow. at the end of which 500 meters darkened trees, when the command air swept through the column. The cars began to turn off the road to the right and left, trying to disperse and hide under the shadow of the forest. And when the Nazi bombers began to dive, the cars slowed down as much as possible, and the Red Army men Ps fell from them, taking their rifles with them. Having run aside from the car, I sprawled on the ground. Raising my head, I watched with fear how small black dots separated from the airplanes and rushed to the ground, realizing that in a few seconds these dots will turn into gigantic columns of smoke, fire, and earth. I instinctively tried to press my body into the dry ground. A wise man said that experience is a teacher who charges a lot for lessons, but no one teaches better than him. I've never had to lie on the ground like that and watch bombs fall, and naturally, I had no experience in determining where they fell. All I could do was to wait and see if I would get away with it, and still curiosity takes over the sense of self-preservation. Again, I quickly lifted my head and saw how one of the dots covered the car. It was the last thing I could see. The ground beneath me shook. Lumps of earth fell from above and hit me painfully. Shrapnel scraped twice against my helmet. I lost track of time. It seemed like an eternity since the first explosions shook the ground. Again, I carefully lifted my head. I see the bombers, attacked by 3 skittish hawks. And to the side, 2 of our fighters are trying to delay the cover planes. Messerschmitt's 5. 7 planes spinning in a frenzied merry-go-round. Even the inexperienced eye can see that the Hawks are fighting desperately brave pilots. They manage to shoot down 2 Nazi planes. Suddenly, one of the Hawks collapses on the wing and falls down, leaving behind a thick plume of black smoke. A black dot separates from it, over which a white parachute dome flashes. One of the Nazi fighters dives at the descending pilot, but the surviving Hawk, saving his comrade, rapidly goes towards the Messerschmitt, intending to meet the enemy head-on. The airplanes are approaching on the same horizontal. It seems that the collision is imminent, but the Nazis' nerves cannot withstand. Just a few seconds before the collision, the plane with the swastika suddenly rises sharply, and at the same moment a long machine gun burst was heard. The Nazi fighter catches fire and falls down. Soon a strong explosion is heard somewhere behind the forest. The battalion pulled into the large settlement of Janowice, and, having safely passed the quiet wooden town, went further to the western Divina. Suddenly the column stopped. A liaison from the battalion commander came running and gave the order. Dismount and take cover in the nearest ravine. While the company occupies its allotted area, I climbed the hill and looked carefully in the direction where the sky is illuminated by the glow of fires, and from where comes the deafening rumble of artillery cannonade. There, according to my assumptions, is Vitebsk. Apparently, the city was in the center of the battle that had broken out. Why have we stopped? Why aren't we rushing to the aid of the fighting men? What task do we have to fulfill? These and other questions crowded into my mind. I sent a petty officer with 5 men to get food. The men are hungry. They haven't had a dewdrop in their mouths all day. What did they bring? I asked when Okremenko returned. Chilkento, carefully lowering the sack to the ground, waved his hand sadly. We'll have to eat bread alone, comrade commander. The food hasn't arrived yet. He unties the sack and, sticking his hand into it, whistles in surprise. Well, comrade commander, this is not bread. Flies eat it. It's some kind of corpse. Having illuminated the contents of the sack with a flashlight, I realized what had happened. Apparently, the soldiers of the home platoon were sitting on the sacks, and the bread, which had managed to stale, had turned into crumbs. What shall we do, comrade commander? Okremenko scratches the back of his head in confusion. Here are the things, flies eat them. The sight of breadcrumbs reminded me of how in the hungry years my father sometimes made his own gruel for dinner. For this he crumbled bread, cut an onion, salted it, and, adding a spoonful of sunflower oil, poured it all with well water and ate it with great appetite. But we can't even make bruja. We have neither salt nor onions, only bread crumbs and water from the nearest stream. The petty officer's puzzled face suddenly lit up with the smile of a discoverer. It must have been the expression on Archimedes' face when he discovered his law, which is now known to every schoolchild. Okremenko hastily took out a kettle from his duffel bag and, having filled it to the top, handed it to Sergeant Surosht. That's how we'll divide this amazing bread, a full kettle each. Okremenko spread his lush mustache with satisfaction. See, the bread distributed in this way was instantly eaten and washed down with raw water. It was forbidden to light fires. At the beginning of the night, Captain Tonkonoshenko reported that the situation has sharply escalated. The German troops forced the western Dvina near Vitebsk and are developing an offensive to the east. The task is to stop the enemy at any cost. Since our battalion had broken away from the regiment, a representative of the 19th Army headquarters temporarily subordinated it to the commander of the rifle regiment defending the area. The latter ordered the battalion to take up the defense on the left flank. From the combat order, it became clear that Captain Tonkonosenko decided to place rifle companies in line, obliging their commanders to keep one platoon in the second echelon. Mortars should equip firing positions in the fighting order of the second rifle company, which Tonkonoshenko put in the center. To lead the companies to the planned positions had to the captain himself, his deputies and chief of staff, because only they had time to get acquainted with the area of defense. It was still dark when the companies took their assigned lines, while I with platoon commanders outlined the locations for the main and reserve firing positions. The mortars fell asleep where they sat down to rest. Together with Stadnyuk, I stopped near the calculation of Sergeant Seroshtana. Karp Silivanenko snores deafeningly, with his big shaggy head down on the base plate and his arms spread wide. The 32-year-old gunner Pavel Steklov, a swarthy-faced, black-haired, curly-haired Pasha the Gypsy, as they call him in the company, is sleeping quietly, leaning against the mortar barrel. The commander of the calculation himself, deep in thought, sits on a knoll, resting his chin on the palm of his hand. Coming closer, I make sure that Siroshtan is also asleep. Stadnyuk hesitantly asks, "Maybe we should let him sleep for 2 or 3 hours? What if the Germans show up?" Overcoming the feeling of pity, I order platoon commanders immediately begin to equip positions and prepare a scheme of fire. The soldier's dream is surprising. Just now we heard a friendly snore before a soft "get up," and everyone is already on their feet. To mean commanders set tasks for the calculations. Slowly I walk among the workers. I stop, look around carefully. The round disk of the moon on one side has already darkened noticeably, and the silvery light faintly illuminates the terrain. On the right, the forest covers the village, through which our column has recently passed. Behind the forest guesses a large lake. It is ahead, in a lowland overgrown with bushes, a winding rivulet flowing into the lake glistens. Behind the river floodplain on the hills stretch the buildings of a large village. A grove darkens behind its northern outskirts on the right bank of the rivulet, where our battalion is deployed now. Right behind the meadow, there begins a huge field sown with something that looks like oats. I am pleased with the positions of the mortar company, successfully chosen by the commander. They are hidden from the enemy by a shrubby hill adjacent to the southern woods, but from the hill we can see the terrain on both sides of the river. While my platoon commanders and I were checking the firing positions and thinking over the scheme of fire, the rays of the rising sun highlighted the outline of the village, field, meadow, groves, and woods. The water surface of the lake turned blue. A light morning breeze rippled the yellow-tinted field. A light haze rose above the rivulet. Familiarizing myself with the positions of the infantry, which we will have to support by fire, I begin with the closest to a second rifle company, in the fighting order of which we are located. Noticing a group of working Red Army soldiers ahead, I go there. Approaching, I make sure that they are digging trenches. A youthless lieutenant like me shows an elderly soldier how to dig a trench for shooting standing up. For some reason, the fighter's trench turned out rectangular. The lieutenant, tracing the trench in the shape of a round well, angrily says, "You, Comrade Bafiliev, not digging a grave for yourself, but a rifle cell. We must do as the regulations require. Do you understand?" he asks, returning the shovel to the Red Army man. "I understand, Comrade Lieutenant." The soldier answers embarrassedly and begins to dig vigorously. "What stubborn people!" The lieutenant is indignant. After all, I showed them what a rifle cell should be like, but they still dig in their own way. And that's it. Lieutenant Nikolaev, commander of the 3rd Platoon. Lieutenant Altunen. "Ah, a mortar man, so we'll hold the defense together." The lieutenant wrinkles his high forehead. "Just don't shoot at your own. And you do not miss the enemy infantry, or we will have no time to support you with fire." I answer. "Be calm." Nikolaev's face becomes stern. "No fascist, as long as we are alive, will not slip to you. But if the tanks come, I can't guarantee it. All hope for the artillerymen." He pointed at the battalion cannon crews that were entrenched in front. "I have 2 or 3 anti-personnel grenades for each soldier. I have nothing to fight with tanks." Nikolaev sighs heavily. That won't do, Lieutenant. I don't agree. Artillerymen are artillerymen, but you prepare a bunch of grenades. Such a bundle, if it gets under the caterpillar, will break it. That's right. Nikolaev is pushing a wrinkled cap over his forehead. Only grenades are needed against infantry. You can fight off the infantry with machine guns and rifles. At worst, you can fight hand-to-hand, but you can't fight tanks hand-to-hand. If they start shelling you, you'll leave your platoon in the dust. All right, we'll use 15 grenades for bundles. Hand them to the most desperate. I advise. We'll have to throw them 10 meters away from the tank. Walking along the positions of the platoon, I was surprised to see that Perfaliv was not the only one digging a grave. The others were preparing the same rectangles. When I asked a tall, shoulder-bearing soldier why he was digging a cell not according to the regulations, he was obviously surprised at my lack of understanding. You're convenient, Comrade Lieutenant. You shoot, repel the enemy, and then you can lie down without leaving your place, take a nap for an hour, if there are dugouts for rest. When they will build them, the soldier hopelessly waves his hand. I leave Nikolaev's platoon with a sense of anxiety. To fight with tanks, we are poorly prepared. Neither infantrymen nor mortars do not have the means to do so. All hopes that the tanks will be stopped by artillery and anti-tank mines, which will put sappers in front of the front edge of the defense. I began to recall how we were trained to fight tanks. I remembered only shoot at the mechanic driver's observation slot. The commander of the rifle company, Levushkin, met at the front edge of the defense, where he checked the firing positions of machine gunners. Senior Lieutenant Levushkin was known in the regiment as a sniper, shooting perfectly from all types of small arms. An excellent methodologist, Levushkin prepared his company well in a short time. At the test firing, it took first place in the regiment in all exercises. We had to meet often at the battalion commander. I hurried to ask the senior lieutenant about the weapons and people of his company. Levushkin has a look of annoyance on his snub-nosed, bony face. I am delaying him, but he patiently answers the questions, looks at the inexperienced lieutenant with undisguised condescension. That's what I was in reality, and therefore studies the mortar fire scheme I prepared with special meticulousness. For the same reason, apparently, he was not surprised by my question, what he thought to do if Nazi tanks appeared at the company's positions. This is the business of the artillerymen and sappers, the senior lieutenant explained instructively. You and ours is to deal with the infantry, and if the tanks do break through, we'll take cover in the trenches, let them pass through, and cut off and destroy the infantry. So let them squeeze me. I'm trying to smile. The senior lieutenant shrugs his shoulders. What to do? So you also have to hide mortars and let the tanks to the massacre of the artillerymen. I tell Levushkin how Lieutenant Nikolaev's platoon is preparing to meet the tanks. Well, AUA. After thinking, agrees Levushkin, I will order, perhaps in all platoons, to prepare bundles of grenades. That day I thought for the first time, is not the reason for the success of the fascist troops, that the main striking force of them are tanks and assault guns. When tanks are used en masse, it is difficult for artillerymen sappers to cope with them. Some part of the tanks will inevitably break into the fighting order of infantry, so we will have to, as in the Civil War, to prepare a bulky bundle. I remember in the movie We Are From Kronstadt, the defenders of Petrograd stopped a White Guard tank just like that. I went to share my doubts with the commander. On the way, having heard me, Captain Tonkonoshenko impatiently waves his hand. We have on the front line only at direct aiming 4 guns, and the divisional artillery, and bundles of grenades bottles with gasoline. This is bushcraft. After moving away for 10 steps, the commander suddenly stops and shouts, "All right, I'll order that in each company were bundles." I asked for a box of grenades for the mortarmen. I made a bundle and, having outlined a small circle with a sapper shovel 10 meters away from the shooting cell, I throw. The bundle falls 2 meters from the boundary of the circle. Only after several throws I finally managed to hit the target accurately. Did you see that? I asked surrounded me commanders. 3 bundles to have in each platoon and 2 people to continuously train in the accuracy of throwing. Realizing that a breakthrough of tanks to the firing positions is not excluded, the platoon quickly dismantled grenades and immediately get down to business. The reserve firing positions were already camouflaged. It remained to finish the slots for people when in the cloudless sky appeared frame. We did not yet know that this Nazi reconnaissance plane was a harbinger of a bombing raid, but it was not them we saw first. Comrade Commander, tanks. I heard from the company's NP the frightened voice of my orderly Misha Stogov, a tall, narrow-shouldered boy, thin as a hazel log. There, tanks. Where? I shouted in surprise, remembering that the binoculars were left at the observation post. I ran there excitedly asking, "Where are the tanks? Whose? Ours?" "I don't know." Embarrassed Misha holds out the binoculars to me. I couldn't see. I look through the eyepieces and slowly glide along the opposite shore. I don't spot the tanks right away. Having looked closely, I count 4 vehicles within the range of visibility. They cautiously, like people looking for a ford, descend. I can't identify the tanks. Maybe ours. Flashes in my head. As if the artillerymen did not hit their own. But the artillerymen are silent. The tanks are speeding up. Their dark silhouettes are becoming sharper. Here one, bypassing some obstacle, turns sideways, on which a cross is clearly drawn. There is no doubt. Fascist. If I had not seen them for the first time, probably, I would have recognized them earlier. Why don't the commanders of anti-tank guns open fire? After all, the machines are within shooting distance. The camouflaged anti-tank guns are still silent. Over our heads, from somewhere in the forest, rustled heavy shells. The ground around the tanks flew up to the sky in gigantic fountains. However, speeding up, the tanks skip to the river and hide in the coastal shrubbery. For about an hour, the enemy vehicles are there, artillery gradually increasing fire, methodically combing the coastal thickets. One of the heavy shells hits the tark. Thick black smoke rises above the shrubbery. Soon 3 vehicles crawl out of there and rush back to the forest at top speed. Someone noisily jumped into the trench. I look back and see a small Red Army soldier with a coil of telephone cable behind his back. After catching his breath, he reports in a hoarse, barely audible voice. "Comrade Lieutenant, Red Army man Susik has arrived by order of the battalion commander to establish telephone communication with you." Come on, my friend, establish it. I was happy and thought, at least through the commander there will be a connection with the commanders of rifle companies. The telephonist, having connected the device, spins the knob for a long time and, tearing his weak voice. "Hello, Spring. Susik is speaking, Susik. I report. The connection is working." I look at the Red Army soldier and involuntarily smile. Small, surprisingly skittish, with flaxen curls on his forehead, he looks like a child among rather tall, tanned mortarmen. Brushing off drops of sweat from his upturned nose, Susik stretches up. "Comrade Commander, 12th on the wire." Taking the phone, I looked in the table of call signs. The 12th number was the battalion commander. "Is 17th here?" I shouted into the phone. "No, 17th. You." I heard Tonkan Oshenko's voice. "Report, how are you?" "Is ready for battle." "So watch the terrain carefully. Hit the infantry for sure. Take care of the mines, don't throw them in vain. Report on the situation every half an hour." Combat warned us to count only on the ammunition we brought with us. I asked the platoon leaders to tell the squad leaders. Petty officer ordered to leave 18 mines in my reserve. Orimenko exclaims with annoyance. And I, Comrade Commander, distributed all the mines, eat them flies, by platoons. I confirm my order. I want to be sure that the reserve mines will be used up at the most critical moment. Shortly before noon, the commander appeared. He led a group of soldiers and sergeants led by a senior lieutenant. Coming up to me, Tonkanoshenko shout, "On the way back, I'll see the results of your work." I was surprised to see a strange army of the commander. There are infantrymen and artillerymen, tankers and communicators. All have tired faces, sunken eyes. The uniforms are dirty, as if they were hiding in the swamp all day through large holes shining under. They must be soldiers who had lost their units. Tonkanoshenko took them to the first company, and when he came back he confirmed my guesses. "I took them the safest area," said the commander. "The right flank is covered by the marshy floodplain of the river. Yes, Lieutenant, the retreat of some very demoralizing. Having examined the well-equipped firing positions and deep shelters, the captain smiled with satisfaction. Well done. Now hold on. Reconnaissance has already visited. From hour to hour we must wait for the main forces." The captain walked resolutely to the command post and suddenly returned. After standing for a minute, he asked. I said that the battalion broke away from the regiment, I nodded silently. Yes, detached, tiredly said the commander. I don't know where the main forces of the regiment are now. That's right, Lieutenant. Now our battalion has become a separate unit, but without its own farm. Grievedly waving his hand, Tonkonoshenko went to his place. How will we fight in isolation from the regiment? No ammunition, no food. Who will supply us? At that time, I did not suppose that we would never see our regiment again, that only after the war I would be able to learn about its fate. However, there was no time for reflection. I had to get ready for my first battle. The sun was at its zenith, when enemy bombers appeared on the horizon, humming relentlessly. Air, air, was heard around the positions. Everyone instantly hid in the crevices. I jumped into my foxhole and aimed binoculars at the planes, on the wings of which German identification marks were already clearly visible. The airplanes were in two tiers. In the lower tier, the bombers were flying in a clear formation. In the upper tier, the E-fighters. I counted about 30 bombers. Passing the front edge of the defense, the planes sharply descend. They are separated from them black dots. Having determined the approximate line of dropping bombs, I understand that most of them will fall behind the defensive positions of the rifle battalions. So, the main strike of aviation is aimed at the firing positions of artillery and the rear. My thoughts are interrupted by a rising howl. I instinctively rushed to the bottom of the trench and felt the ground shuddered, shook, sand crumbled from the walls. Muffled bursts were heard. No sooner had the bombardment died down than thunderous booms came from behind the forest on the opposite bank of the rivulet, and the positions of the rifle companies were hidden in thick clouds of airborne earth. Fear crawls into my heart like a slippery snake. I want to close my eyes and hide in the deepest possible crevice. Pull yourself together, Lieutenant. I mentally command myself. No 2 deaths. I look at the orderly and the telephonist. Have they noticed my confusion? But they didn't care about me. The orderly had his forehead against the wall of the trench, and the telephonist, squatting, pressed the telephone receiver to his ear and closed his eyes. Soon the bursts raised clouds of dust over the positions of our company. Now only one thought was drilling my brain. Will the mortars survive in this hell? Forgetting the fear chilling my heart, I resolutely rise. Suddenly the trench seemed to jump, and something fell on me. I felt that I could not move. With difficulty, I freed my hands, and with a desperate effort, I climbed out of the collapse. I looked back and found my orderly on my left, trying to pull his legs out of the crumbling earth, and on my right, above the heap of earth, I saw the head of the telephonist, like a poppy head on a thin stalk. No torso, no arms. The eyes, rounded with horror, stare at me point blank. Susik, are you alive? I shout, frantically raking the ground with my hands. The telephonist does not answer. Not a spark of life in his frozen gaze. No, Horimenko. I call. Petrenko, come here. The petty officer, seeing Susik's head sticking out, gasped in amazement and rushed back. A minute later he came with a sapper's shovel and began frantically digging up the telephonist. The orderly, who came running after the petty officer, hastily opened his medical bag and took out a vial of smelling salts and put it to Susik's nose. Suddenly he sneezed thinly and pitifully. Alive, Penko rejoiced. Sticking my head out of the trench, I tried to see what was going on around me and involuntarily shuddered when I saw a huge crater, the trace of a large caliber shell that had exploded. 5 meters closer, and only a mound of earth would remind me of my observation post. The enemy's artillery was firing lightly. Looking back, I see how Comus Susik, who is holding the telephone receiver with a dead grip, is being extracted from the debris and put on a spread-out overcoat. Susik, Petrenko calls, trying to get the telephonist out of shock and unclench his cramped hand. He rubs his temples, gives him a sniff of ammonia. Finally, Susik shudders, looks around in surprise, and suddenly 2 light streams of tears flow down his cheek. Shenko, with an important look, puts his potions in a bag, and, with a deep look at Susik, says something in Latin, and in Russian adds, "All right, he's awake." I had noticed before that Petrenko had a weakness for Latin and tried to surprise his comrades with medical terms. Kindly Okremenko bent over Susik, covering him with his mighty body from the clods of earth, falling from above, stroking his flaxen curls affectionately, saying, Well, little man, everything's all right. You'll live for 100 years. Having ordered to transfer the telephonist to the nearest shelter, I instructed the orderly who had come to his senses to drag the telephone set there. No matter how much I wanted to visit the platoons to see how the mortars withstood the first barrage of fire in their lives, I involuntarily froze in place and looked anxiously at the squat Nazi tanks crawling out of the forest, behind which the figures of infantrymen fly. It is difficult to convey the feelings that seized me at the sight of the hated enemy. Will we be able to withstand it? The enemy is so damn strong, fear whispers to me, no one can resist him. As the drowned, suppressing this thought, I convince myself, we must endure slavery or victory. There is no other way out. Voronov, Seroshtin, Lysov, Brashenko, Polivoda, Miship stand before my eyes. I think about them with fondness. Such people will not let you down. And the long-forgotten words from the school textbook come to life in my memory. We will lay down our bones, for the dead have no shame. Yes, the dead know no shame. So we have to fight so that to stay alive and that the shame did not fall on our heads. And the enemy is getting closer. The bursts covered the tanks with a black veil. When the ground settled down and the smoke cleared, I could not refrain from a joyful exclamation. 3 vehicles were hit. Above one of them, a bright flame was still flickering, and a plume of dark brown smoke was stretching. It was obvious that a shell had hit the fuel tank. But more and more vehicles appeared from the forest, and at top speed they were heading towards the river. Despite the continuous artillery fire, the tanks managed to cross to our bank. Having got out of the thickets, they uncontrollably tear at the positions of the combat guard, clinging to the tanks' running infantry. If it breaks through to the positions of the combat guard, he will be unfortunate. I'm raising the red flag satire on the fascist infantry. I shout and I don't recognize my voice, so shrill and thin. The platoon commanders also noticed the terrible danger hanging over the combat guard. Mortars hit almost volley, and my heart sinks. What if they miss? But the mines are bursting among the fascist infantry. I cannot refrain from a joyful exclamation. Well done. Meanwhile, the rifle companies are opening fire. At first, there is a fractional clatter of several machine guns. I note to myself, not all of them. The involuntary members' tactical training. Do not rush to reveal the system of their fire. Introduce firepower gradually and only at the climax of the attack open fire from all your available firepower. Apparently, the commanders of rifle companies are well aware of this truth. However, machine gunners are clearly nervous. The lines are unreasonably long, almost uninterrupted. They shoot until the tape runs out, so you can use up all the ammunition in one day. With concern, I think, and with irritation note the same uncalculated mortars. No Remenko. Trying to overpower the noise of the battle, I call the petty officer. No, sir, comrade petty officer. Even louder shouts my orderly Misha Stogov. Mo to comrade. Nay, I'm listening, comrade lieutenant. Bowing low to the ground, but trying to keep his hand at his helmet, the petty officer who came running to the call answers. Nikolai Fedorovich, Ukremenko's good-natured face expresses full attention and readiness to fulfill any order. He squints with pleasure when I call him by name and patronymic. Tell the platoon commanders to fire as sparingly, methodically, and strictly aimed as possible. Yes, pass the ore. Sparingly, methodically, and with precision. Ukremenko stretches out, but the shrapnel whistling over his head makes him bend his mighty back again. Ukremenko ran to carry out the order, and I find the friendly fire of riflemen and mortarmen blew away the fascist infantry as the wind blows away the fluff from dandelions. The infantry retreated to the river. At the same time, the tanks toured the trenches of the combat guard and moved to the positions of the rifle companies. This forced the artillerymen, whose guns were camouflaged in the fighting order of the 2nd and 3rd companies, to open direct fire. To the tanks, which blew up on the mines placed by the sappers, the artillerymen added 2 more. They stand, shrouded in smoke, through which broke through the flames. This apparently sobered the Nazi tankers. Shooting back, they began to retreat to the river. Overflowing with joy, I jumped out of hiding and shouted. The attack of the tanks was repulsed. Hooray for the artillerymen! Although the merit in repelling the tank attack belonged to the artillerymen, I felt so proud, as if my own hands guided the guns. The fear that the tanks had inspired was gone. The devil is not as bad as they make it out to be, I thought. Fascist tanks are burning up perfectly. But somewhere in the back of my mind still lurked anxiety. What if the artillerymen will not stop, and we have to face the tanks? I heard from soldiers and commanders who had been in battle that the infantry engaged in combat with tanks and often succeeded by skillful use of bundles of grenades and bottles filled with gasoline. But it is one thing to listen to stories, and quite another to experience a duel with an armoured vehicle. What kind of nerves you have to face it, with a bundle of grenades or a bottle filled with gasoline. Do I have strong enough nerves? I couldn't help doubting it. It became somehow uncomfortable. If I, the commander, such uncertainty, how worried the soldiers. I wanted to hurry around the calculations, to look in the faces of the soldiers, maybe to encourage. No sooner had I made a few steps to the positions of Lieutenant Voronov's platoon than I was called by Oraimenki. Comrade Commander, combat calls. I pick up the phone. I hear the joyful voice of Tonkanoshenko. All tune in. Did you see how we have cleared them? He said it with such pride, as if he had knocked down the Nazi tanks. I told you the artillery wouldn't let them through. How are you doing? How many casualties? At the first opportunity, ferry the wounded to the battalion infirmary. As soon as the fascist infantry attacks again, hit them with full force. Got it? Bye. Handing the phone to Okremenko, I jump out of the trench and run to the first platoon. I jump into cover and find only the loader Afanasy Sidorenko, a silent and slow man. He is lying with his wounded leg up and moaning quietly. The sight of the dead and wounded is still unfamiliar to me. My heart clenches painfully. Be patient, my friend, I say, Sidorenko. As soon as there will be a lull, we'll take you to the battalion infirmary. I found the whole first platoon at the mortars. The squads were tidying up the firing position. Some were installing mortars overturned by the blast wave. Others were cleaning the trenches from the earth thrown by the ruptures, and Lieutenant Voronov was checking the aiming. With joyful surprise, I look at Soroshtan. I was told that he was wounded, that a piece of shrapnel had hit him in the head. Sergeant Soroshtan, take cover. I sternly order, seeing the bandage white from under his helmet. Wounded men don't belong here. Running up to me, Soroshtan lifts his helmet and, pointing to his left ear, Comrade Company Commander, I only lost half of my ear. My eyes see, my arms and legs are working. We'll fight again. And, not holding back a smile, adds, I must pay the Germans for my ear. Pleased with the cheerful look of the sergeant, I shake his hand with feeling. Bypassing the firing positions and making sure that the mortars are in full combat readiness, with close attention to follow the development of events. A new barrage of artillery fire forced me to dive into the trench. At least 2 artillery batteries were firing at the company's positions. However, the soldiers and commanders in the deep crevices felt calm. They were now convinced that their labour was not wasted. It is a pity only. There was not enough time to strengthen the walls of the trenches with fascines, so they crumbled every now and then. I was called to the phone again by the commander of 18th. Do you see the infantry? I see. I confirmed, looking out of the trench, hiding behind the tanks. Just to cut off the infantry. Don't let it break through to the front line. At this time, the tanks are zigzagging so that the artillerymen can't take aim. And yet 2 cars caught fire. When there were no more than 100 meters left to the firing trenches, the tanks increased their speed and stretched out in 2 columns. They decided to skip the minefield along the old tracks. Here again the guns, standing at direct fire, entered the battle. I can see well how the artillerymen of the gun nearest to me deftly send shell after shell to the head tanks. They stun on the surviving track. The other smoked. The following ones try to go around them on the right and left and hit mines. The rest skip the minefield and move to the positions of the rifle companies. Following them runs infantry. The decisive moment has come. If the Nazi infantry manages to break through to our trenches at the same time as the tanks, the soldiers, driven by the tanks in the gaps, will die. This thought involuntarily throws me out of the trench. And I, afraid that in such noise the commanders will not hear my order, run without noticing the bursting of shells and mines, without hearing the whistling of shrapnel and stray bullets. At the firing positions of Lieutenant Voronov, I desperately shout, heavy fire on the infantry, no mines to spare. Before I reached Lieutenant Stepanov's platoon, I suddenly flew to the ground from a sharp push in the back. A hot blast wave passed over me. A splinter rattled on my helmet. Clods of dry earth hit my palms, which were spread on the ground. Someone slid off my back, and I, half deafened, heard a voice coming from afar. I'm sorry, comrade, that I pushed so hard. Surprised, I looked back and saw heavy-breathing Misha Stogov wiping away rivulets of sweat with his dusty sleeve, which made his face look like that of a tattooed native, embarrassedly looking at me. I am sorry, I didn't mean to. If not Stogov, I would have been riddled with shrapnel, I thought, feeling unexpected tenderness for his quiet and modest resident. Are you not wounded, Misha? I asked worriedly, not taking my eyes off his shredded uniform. No, Comrade Komroti, I don't think so, hesitantly answers Stogov. Having made sure that the orderly got away with small scratches, I sigh with relief and run over to the trenches of the second platoon. The mortars send mine after mine at the fascist infantry. They fly out of the barrels continuously and burst in the thick of the attacking infantry, remembering the test firing before being sent to the front. I began to fear that one of the mines, not having time to fly out of the barrel, would collide with another, and Noders, be careful. The mortars continue to fire at the same rate. The enemy infantry is stopped. The accurate fire of mortars and machine guns forced it to lie down. Now it was necessary to sweep by meter the frontier, behind which the fascists, not to let them entrench. The battalion mortars are joined by regimental mortars. The fascists cannot withstand the intense fire. Watching the battlefield, Lieutenant Stepanov joyfully shouts, "The fascists are draping. Drapa ute." The lieutenant is right. The fascist infantry is rapidly rolling back. But it's too early to rejoice. Even without binoculars, I can see how the broken tanks are irrigating our trenches, methodically, from end to end, like tractors on ploughing. Suddenly the tanks, leaving the trenches, moved on the battalion guns, persistently sending shell after shell. On the gun nearest to me, 3 tanks were coming, turning in a fan. At times the gun was covered with a shroud of smoke and soot, but I could see the artilleryman's dexterity. There were only 2 of them left, but they managed to set fire to one tank and opened fire on the second. I could see a shell hitting its turret and knocking out a spark and bouncing off it, going around a huge crater. The tank for a moment opened its side. It was enough for the artillerymen to put a shell into it. The tank smoked and stopped. But then a 3rd tank loomed over the gunners. I thought that the gunners would try to escape in the shelter, but they did not move from the place and almost at point-blank range made the last shot. In a moment, a tank had dwarfed both the gun and the gunners. For a few minutes it spun in one place, trying to wipe out anything that might remind of the brave Soviet lads, then turned toward the hill where the mortar firing positions were. Everything is dead, I thought with despair. What to do? A bundle of grenades caught my eye. Formerly formidable, now it seems to me toy-like. How can I fight an armored monster with such a light weapon? In words it is easy, but in reality it is not easy to run up and throw this bundle under the track. My arms felt weak for some reason, and my legs felt like absorbent cotton. Don't hesitate. Lieutenant, the company is on the brink of death. I ordered myself, grabbed grenades and ducking, running to a deep crater in the path of the tank. The ground under my feet boiled. A large caliber machine gun was beating, and I instinctively fell down. A new line whistled over my head. I crawled 5 meters away and rushed forward again, and again the machine gun line somehow miraculously missed me. Falling down, out of the corner of my eye I catch 3 figures crawling towards the tank from the firing position of the 1st platoon. Apparently, the thought of grenades did not come to me alone. It's the tankers whose attention is distracted by my defections do not notice the daredevils. Taking cover in a funnel, I carefully watch the development of events, and mortars with the same intensity continue to fire on the infantry. The tank is already about 15 meters from the funnel where the soldiers are hiding. Here flies the first bunch of grenades. In front of the tank soared flame. The machine swerved to the left, and the second bunch of grenades flew after it. A new explosion shook the ground, but it did not stop the tank. Suddenly the tankers, as if frightened that in the numerous craters lurks a new danger, backed away, turned the car, and crawled back. I looked after the fleeing tank and thought with annoyance, it is not so easy to get a bundle under the track. Having carefully examined the battlefield, I make sure that the fascist infantry this time failed to break into the location of our battalion, and the surviving fascist tank is leaving, breaking through the fighting order of the 1st Rifle Company. And at that moment, something incredible happened. On the left flank of the 1st Company heard indiscriminate rifle fire, desperate cries, and people ran to the rear from the front edge. Directly under machine gun fire, which opened the Nazi tankers. Some fell at once, as if tripping over an invisible obstacle. Others continued to run, apparently not realizing that they were running towards death. I look on in despair and do not understand what is happening. Then some unknown force picks me up. I rush to them, shouting at the top of my voice, "Get down! Get down!" The panic-stricken people don't hear. Only 4 Red Army soldiers reached the hill, behind which were the positions of mortars. Having shot 3 times in the air with my revolver, I forced them to hide in the shell crater. Jumping in after them, I found 3 of them unarmed. Only the 4th clutched his rifle tightly in his hands. Closely pressed against each other, they look at me with sightless eyes, and, like fish thrown on the shore, with wide-open mouths grabbing the hot air, with noise and wheezing exhale it. For the first time seeing such a panic manifestation of fear, I look at them with surprise and pity. It becomes uncomfortable to think, could it happen to me too? What company? We don't know, replies a sturdy, broad-shouldered, bony-faced infantryman of about 35 with complete indifference. What do you mean you don't know? Just like that. All of us who came out of the encirclement were gathered and put in the defense, but they didn't tell us which battalion and company we were included in. Reinforcements. I remembered how in the morning Captain Tonkanozhenko led past me a group of soldiers and commanders to reinforce the 1st Rifle Company. That's how reinforced. Apparently, people gathered from disparate units cannot be entrusted with an independent section of defense. If they were distributed a few people in each company, such a disaster would not happen. Or maybe, on the contrary, maybe these mentally broken people in a critical moment would have caused panic among the untrained fighters. It's hard to predict. Everything is learned by experience. How many battles one has to go through to find an answer to such questions which were not thought about in peacetime. After all, it went without saying that we are all men of duty, which means that we are able to overcome the feeling of fear, not to let it grow into psychosis when a man ceases to be a man. Your last name? I ask the cheekbone infantryman. Sergeant Vashukov. He answers reluctantly, standing up slightly. You were included in the 1st Rifle Company. Why did you run away from the battlefield? Do you know that for this you are entitled to be shot? The lieutenant turned pale, looked confusedly into my face, as if hoping that he had misheard me. Yes, I repeated. The court-martial for fleeing the battlefield will not give less than a firing squad. His companions, who also got the meaning of what I said, lowered their heads, avoiding my angry look. The tanks appeared in our rear, tries to justify his flight. Someone shouted, "Save yourself," and ran, followed by another, and me. First of all, not tanks, but 1 tank. More than 10 of them broke through, but only 1 survived. If everyone had fought as you did, the tanks would have destroyed the battalion. There in front, I pointed to the positions of the 1st Company. Sit yesterday's miners. This is their first battle, and they did not run. The fugitives are silent, lowering their eyes. That's what, Basyukov. Decisively, I say to the sergeant, go back and report to the commander of the 1st Company about what happened. Maybe he will give you an opportunity to redeem yourself in battle. The faces of the fugitives revived, and hope flashed in their eyes. Thank you, Comrade Lieutenant. Vasyukov looked at his companions. This will not happen again. We will die, but we will not retreat without orders. Rising to his full height and waving his rifle, he shouted, "Let's go, keep up." Returning to the firing positions of mortars, I found out that at the same time with me to meet the tank that broke through rushed Lieutenant Voronov, party leader Lisov and gunner Pavel Steklov. Voronov and Lysov survived, but Steklov, our Pasha the Gypsy, was run over by the tank. The crater in which he took shelter was not deep enough. I look at the remains of the deceased, mutilated beyond recognition, and I see his courageous face, eyes burning with anthracite luster, black, curly ringlets of hair, and I think I hear his voice, proudly saying, "I am Russian, and my maternal grandmother was stolen by my grandfather from a gypsy tabor. For the first time Pavel saw a fascist tank and was not afraid. He fought with it to save his comrades. Thank you, soldier." For more than 3 hours there was a relative calm. People were busy clearing and strengthening firing positions and shelters, sending the wounded to the rear, burying the dead. To our great joy, Oremenko brought 20 boxes of mines. The company was ready for new battles. And at 6 o'clock in the evening, the fascists again went on the attack. This time tanks followed the infantry, supporting it with fire. Suddenly came the rumble of airplane engines. From behind us, 3 Red Star bombers jumped out of the woods. Soon thick clouds of dust and smoke rose on the meadow where the tanks were crawling. The planes repeated the blow, and the Nazi tankers turned to flight, and the infantry, deprived of support, left. However, at the junction of the 1st and 2nd Rifle Companies, broke through a large group of fascists. They attacked Lieutenant Nikolaev's platoon, defending in the 2nd echelon. Surrounded fighters put up a desperate resistance, and this saved the mortars. My first thought was to immediately organize a circular defense. What about Nikolaev's platoon? Let them die in front of my eyes? No, after such a disgrace cannot. Gathering about 36 soldiers and commanders, all except the gunners and loaders, who continued to fire, and Suzik, who kept in touch with Captain Noshenko, I rushed to the rescue. Nearby, I see a puny figure of Stadnyuk, who appeared from somewhere. I try to persuade him to return to the mortars who remained at the firing position, but the junior political officer strongly protests, declares that his place is where most of the men of the company are, and, snatching a revolver, he runs for some time not a step behind me. He is overtaken and overshadowed by the men, and I lose sight of him. Our appearance from behind a shrubby hill was unexpected. I can already distinguish the faces of the fascists who were between the mortars and Lieutenant Nikolaev's men. Without stopping, I threw a grenade under the feet of the nearest group of soldiers and rushed into hand-to-hand combat. That's when the training received at the bayonet classes at the school came in handy. When I fought off a dagger-shaped bayonet aimed at my chest, I threw my rifle forward with such force that I couldn't pull out the bayonet, which was deeply embedded in something soft and somehow stuck. With difficulty, I pull it out. The fascist falls down, and I notice a glint to my right, very close to me. Another bayonet is aimed at my side. I realize that I will not have time to repel it, and I clearly feel how it is about to enter me, turning my ribs. My body seemed to freeze. I stopped hearing, and suddenly the fascist's grinning, sweaty face is distorted by a grimace of unbearable pain. I can't hear the cry, and he topples over on his back. Only now I recognize my savior, Pater Glysov. His stubby, muscular figure appears before my eyes, then disappears in the thick of the enemy. He wields the hand machine gun like a pickaxe in a mine. With short, sharp swings, he brings the buttstock down on the heads of the attacking fascists. Stomping, furious, swearing, sniffing, screaming, wheezing of the dying. Blinding rage covers me, my face is burning. Involuntarily the words come out. Gads, gads! The desperate jerk, I hardly hurry to help Lysov. At the last moment I manage to take away the enemy bayonet from him. It turns out that the Partag is wounded but does not leave the battle. Writhing in pain, he furiously waves the butt of the machine gun. On the left, clinging closely to me, clumsily rushes my lanky, orderly Misha Stogov. Each lunge with a rifle he accompanies with such a tearful grunt, as if he was splitting oak logs with a cleaver. From behind the back of the nasal German, an officer sticks out. A shiny face, moustache a la Hitler. He fires a pistol. He must have wounded Lysov. Well, hold on, you viper! Throwing the rifle in my left hand, I snatch the revolver and, almost without aiming, pull the trigger twice. The bullets did not pass me by. The first to fall was the soldier who was covering the officer, and the mustache was hidden behind him. Saving ammunition, I continue to wield the bayonet. The faces of the enemies, disfigured by the beastly grin of their teeth, flashed before my eyes. The faces of my comrades in arms were almost unrecognizable, and for the first time I thought that several such hand-to-hand fights can cripple a person's psyche. War is an accumulation of horrors, but hand-to-hand combat, when people mad with rage often literally bite each other in the throat, is its most terrible generation. 'Tis a pain from the sliding blow of the buttstock on my left shoulder enraged me. I dashed forward with one desire, to lay down more fascists until an enemy bullet or bayonet would not get. On the left, wielding a rifle, something fiercely shouts Lieutenant Pozdynayshev. In the heat of the battle his helmet was knocked off. A trickle of blood runs down his face. The lieutenant staggers from weakness, but encouraging himself with a hoarse voice, with difficulty repulses the advancing fascists. Realizing that Pozdynayshev is in mortal danger, I try to make my way to him. At the last moment I notice how Sergeant Vostrikov and Fighter Supranenko, saving their commander, take the blow on themselves. At some distance from me, fighting mortars led by Lieutenant Voronov. I remember, in the first days of my stay in the regiment, Voronov impressed me with a brilliant technique of bayonet combat. But in this deadly battle he surpassed himself. The soldiers instinctively huddle close to him. In the center of his group I notice Stadnyuk, who, having apparently shot all his cartridges, waves his revolver over his head like a cavalryman with a saber. His ringing, appealing voice reaches me. "Ruby Kale, beat the bastards. They'll kill the poor fellow." Flashes an alarming thought at the sight of the unarmed junior political officer, but with joy I notice that the soldiers are clearly trying to push back Stadnyuk. Do not let him break forward. The unequal battle continues. German artillery and mortars are trying to build a thicket of bursting shells and mines around the place of the melee. Apparently, they do not want to miss reinforcements from our side. Streaking through to Poznyshev's group, only now I fully realize how much the enemy outnumbered us. But there's no turning back. With a desperate dash, we managed to join the group of Lieutenant Poznychev, who, bleeding, lying on the ground, covered by Sergeant Vostrikov and soldiers, fiercely fighting off the advancing fascists. We are no longer able to move forward a step. And 100 meters away from us, the surviving Red Army soldiers, led by Lieutenant Nikolaev, are fighting from the last forces. With every minute, the situation of our groups becomes more and more difficult. There is only one thing left: to sell our lives more dearly. Suddenly, I notice how a white-haired fascist, who had just fiercely wielded a buttstock, stops, then pivots, and, turning abruptly, runs away. Behind him, one or the other is running away. It turned out that a group of fighters with rifles were rushing from the heights to help us. A long hooray broke through the noise of the battle. Having picked up the battle cry, mortars fiercely threw themselves on the trembling enemy, as if it was not them a minute ago desperately fought off the advancing grey-green uniforms. Pursuing the fascists, I encountered an unfamiliar major and our commander. They brought reinforcements, all those who could be gathered without the risk of weakening the shooting positions. Help came at a critical moment. Suddenly retreating Germans stopped, began to thrash. It is the commander of the 2nd Rifle Company, Levushkin, who did not open machine gun fire on the rolling back towards his company grey-green mass, for fear of hitting their own. With a group of soldiers cut the path of the enemy. The mousetrap slammed shut. Trying to come to the aid of his group, which was threatened with destruction, the enemy makes a new attack. And again our pilots come to the rescue and drive away the tanks, and the battalion with dense machine gun and mortar fire repels the infantry. Finally, the infantry broke through is finished. And just then I found out that there was no junior political officer among us. The whole company rushed to look for him. In a quarter of an hour, Misha Stogov, out of breath, comes running and informs that Stadnyuk was found under the corpse of a fascist. The soldiers carefully carry Stadnyuk and Poznygayev. Poznygayev is dead. Ivan Afanasyevich has no wounds on his body. A nursing instructor is tending to him. Here Stadnyuk opened his eyes and stared at us incomprehensibly, then tried to get up. Having finally come to his senses, the political officer told us that a German of enormous stature had rushed at him, probably the one under which Stadnyuk was found. The Nazi's head was crushed. This saved the junior political officer from death, who, in the hustle and bustle of hand-to-hand combat, took death away from our Ivan Afanasyevich. It was difficult to establish, but thanks to him the junior political officer got away with only a slight contusion. I ordered the commander of the 1st platoon, Lieutenant Sergei Voronov, to pick up the wounded and return to the firing positions. But what a sight I found them in. Everything around is ploughed over, overturned, mangled, as if a giant plough had gone through. I linger near a mortar, which is something fantastic. Yeah, no amount of repairs will fix it. In general, 2 barrels are out of service. At the observation point, to my sincere joy, I see Susek, who, judging by his businesslike appearance, has completely recovered from his misfortune. Seeing me, he jumps up, stretches out, not letting go of the telephone receiver, and stares at me with his childishly clear eyes. "Well, Homer," I ask with concern, "alive and well?" "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant, everything's all right." Susek has an embarrassed smile on his face. A minute later, he asks me to the phone. Tonkonozhenko's voice still sounds cheerful. It seems that he is satisfied with the results of the baptism of fire. The battalion successfully repulsed all attacks, although the first battle was more difficult than thought. We lost a lot of soldiers and commanders, but the fascists paid for it dearly. In short, our commander had reason to be proud of his battalion. 17th. He shouts into the phone. "In an hour I expect you with a report on the state of the farm." When the platoon commanders reported the losses, I felt uneasy. The company was reduced by 17 men, not counting the wounded who wished to stay in the line. The harsh reality gave cruel lessons, and one of the first we for victory has to pay a heavy price. A bitter thought flashed. If it goes on like this, there will be no one left of the company. Is all to blame for my inexperience. A feeling of deep anxiety overwhelms me. Wanting to cheer people up, I went through the platoons. It turned out, however, that it was not me who cheered up the mortars, but they cheered me up. No sign of despondency. The brutal repulse, which was given to the fascists, made even the wounded forget about their wounds. They, together with the healthy ones, were tearing around the firing position, putting it in order. And only at moments when it seemed to them that no one could see them, they relaxed and a grimace of pain distorted their faces. I inquired about Lysov's well-being. His wound was also, fortunately, light. The bullet had only grazed his arm. All the wounded who remained in the ranks sent to the battalion infirmary. It was hot, and even a trifling wound could cause blood poisoning. Gradually the excitement subsided. I could more calmly comprehend everything that I had to go through and evaluate my actions. Deep down, I am not satisfied with myself. I showed too much nervousness, which apparently did not go unnoticed. I did not always correctly determine the place where I needed to be in order to timely influence the actions of the company. I didn't control mortar fire specifically enough. Fire on the fascist infantry. Heavy fire. Do not spare the mines. So them, the bastards, refine the sights. That was what I was hearing in the excitement of battle, instead of the statutory artillery commands. Obviously, I lacked training and practice. I was tormented by the thought. I am giving commands incorrectly. After all, we were trained to command a rifle unit, and also embarrassed me that I doubted my courage. I did not show any obvious cowardice, but during the battle I sometimes felt such a fear of death that I had to overcome it with a huge effort of will. So what is bravery? Am I a brave man or a coward? I could not decide after the first battle. In addition, I became convinced that I did not quite accurately imagine modern combat. In my imagination, for example, formed such a classic scheme of defensive combat. The enemy infantry approaching, the defending fighters destroy it with accurate fire, and when the survivors of the enemy break through to the front line of defense, commanders rise from the trenches with the exclamation "Forward!" For the motherland, enraged Red Army soldiers in a single impulse rush at the enemy and in close combat finish him. That's how I imagined the picture of the battle. However, for some reason I completely lost sight of the enemy aviation. It remained somewhere beyond the boundary of tactical combat, but it was the aviation of the first firmly frayed our nerves and took out of action many fighters and commanders. Here I gratefully remembered my teachers who tirelessly told us, "Cadets, do not spare your strength. Burrow into the ground at any stop on the battlefield. This is the salvation of an infantryman." The sweat with which we poured abundantly on the ground was not waste. How many lives were saved by deep shelters when we were mercilessly bombed, and when our location was ploughed over by shells and mines. I bow low to you, my dear Lieutenant Efemenko, for not sparing us in tactical training, mercilessly forcing us to chisel the frozen ground of the training field. Our dear teachers did not take into account one thing. They did not teach us not to be afraid of tanks. During the years of study, I did not even have to stand next to a tank to feel that I could survive in the trench if it will be blasted by the caterpillars of the steel giant. And now we have to engage in a duel with fascist tanks, as with prehistoric giants, to which you do not know how to approach. I remember that we were told that the fight with tanks will be conducted by aviation, artillery and engineers, and infantrymen should be prepared for a fight with enemy infantry. But the Nazis make the main bet on tanks. Tank rollers, they clear the way for their infantry. What can an infantryman use against a tank? An anti-personnel grenade? A bottle of gasoline? Of course, it's an unequal fight. To my shame, I would rather go into battle against a dozen infantrymen than face one-on-one with a tank. That day I realized what tank phobia is. Will I be able to overcome it? This thought did not get... It got dark. It became cooler and quieter. Having moved a little away from my observation point, I lowered myself on the grass. My uniform smells of sweat, dust and smoke. I can't stop thinking about my dead comrades, with whom I've already managed to become. My heart unaccustomedly pinches. My shoulders ache slightly. So ended the first day at the front. Late in the evening at the command post of the battalion gathered unit commanders and their deputies on political part. Did not appear commanders of 2 rifle companies. Killed Levushkin. The commanders of both platoons of anti-tank guns were killed. Combat Tonkonozhenko, listening carefully to our reports, sighed heavily. He did not expect that the victory came at such a high price. The companies lost killed and wounded almost a third of their staff, missing a fourth of the machine guns and 2 mortar. 2 anti-tank guns out of 4 were also put out of action. The figures of spent ammunition were also quite upsetting. After a rather long reflection, Captain Tonkonozhenko raised his head and, looking closely at all those gathered, said in a voice saddled with grief and fatigue, "Before dawn to replenish ammunition. Ammunition, mines, grenades and shells in 2 or 3 hours promised to be delivered to the battalion ammunition station from the neighbouring regiment. Send for us, they'll feed the men. There's lunch in the camp kitchens. It'll be delivered directly to the companies. Find a sheltered place for the kitchens and send soldiers to them by squad. Bury all the dead by morning according to military custom. With honor, the wounded are to be sent for treatment through the battalion infirmary. Finish within 3 hours." Sir Deputy Commander on Political Part Senior Political Officer Pigov drew our attention to the fact that for a lot of things we did not forget about the living people, about the fighters with whom it is necessary to talk, to tell them about the results of the first day of fighting, that they withstood the baptism of fire with honor, that now they were convinced that the Nazis can be beaten. Admittedly, at that moment I was pleased with myself. After all, I had already accomplished everything that Pigov was talking about. The night passed relatively quietly. The enemy only occasionally shelled the roads. We were preparing for new battles. Stadnyuk, who categorically refused to go to the infirmary, rested under the supervision of Petrenko in the shelter. Only in the morning I managed to doze off, and what I had experienced during the day was repeated in my dream. Somewhere running, making desperate lunges with a rifle, clearing the way in a solid mass of soldiers in grey-green uniforms. But the more I kill them, the more of them get in my way. They come in a solid wall, like rats in a natural disaster, a wall of dagger-shaped bayonets inexorably coming at me, and I, wishing to draw the soldiers behind me, rush at them with a desperate cry of horror. But there is no voice, only a muffled croak escapes my throat. Suddenly terrible explosions scattered the enemies, bristling with bayonets, and my comrades, and I myself fly into some abyss. Not thyself thing, comrade commander. I hear Misha Stogov's voice, and waking up, I realize that I'm lying prostrate on the ground, and next to me is a frightened orderly who has covered his head with his hands. Shells are bursting. The ground shudders under us. Something painfully hits my back. Did the Nazis decide to attack at night? Flashed in my head. Heavily, I rise to my feet and, having corrected my helmet, try to see what is happening at the front line. Through the pre-dawn grey haze, I see that there, where the 2nd Rifle Company is located, something incomprehensible is going on. Over the trenches, soldiers are flashing at full height, and, it seems, in German uniforms. I greedily put my eyes on the binoculars, and everything became clear at once. The Nazis broke into the company's positions. Feeling that the artillery fire on the location of my company weakened, I give the command, "Matter to arms. We will hit our own." Suddenly I see the fascists fleeing from our positions. Now we can hit them with mortars. I give the command to open fire. Through the smoke of explosions I notice that the fleeing figures disappeared, so they lay down. We couldn't do more. Heavy artillery fire forced the mortars to hide in the shelters. I ask Lieutenant Stepanov to get to the observation post of the commander of the 2nd Rifle Company and find out what happened to them. An hour later, Stepanov returned safely. It turns out that at dawn the Germans undertook a reconnaissance search and captured our soldiers. Having told about what happened, Stepanov looks at me strangely, as if he wants to add something and does not dare. I in turn look at him questioningly. The comrade thinks. The lieutenant stops talking. Drops of sweat glisten on his button nose. Well, what does comrade think? I impatiently ask, surprised by the embarrassment of the commander. He believes that the soldiers died under our mortar fire along with the fascists who captured them. Stepanov sadly waved his hand. As if a needle has entered my heart. Should not have opened fire, but who thought that this would happen? Admittedly, I had no idea that among the fleeing fascists are our fighters. When I put myself in the place of the fighters who fell into the clutches of the enemy, I thought, it is better to die in battle than to be in fascist captivity. Frankly speaking, until the end of the war, fascist captivity was more frightening to me than death.